When we hear the term woke and the command issued by social justice warriors to stay woke, what does the term mean? And what does imperative ask of us? The phenomena associated with woke culture, cancel culture, trigger warnings, bias reporting, safe spaces, have, some would argue, turned us into a nation of snowflakes, individuals who weaponize any form of criticism and relabel it as violence and abuse. Now, how did we get into this position? Exactly what are the origins and the character of contemporary social justice movements that spawn a culture of woke supremacists? And how do we assess the damage done to individual lives and society in general? Is this new wokeism a form of purging, ideological cleansing, the new McCarthyism? And if so, how do we fight back? What is corporate socialism and woke capitalism? And how do these social phenomena coexist in a capitalist society such as the one that exists in America? Finally, who is Michael Rectenwald, and how has his professional and personal life been upended and greatly compromised by the idea of pathogens that suffuse and constitute these social movements? Well, let's find out. I'm Jason Hill, and this is The Jason Hill Show. My guest today is Dr. Michael Rectenwald, who is the author of 11 books, including Thought Criminal, Beyond Woke, Springtime for Snowflakes, Social Justice and Its Postmodern Parentage. He was a professor of liberal studies and global liberal studies at New York University, NYU, from 2008 to 2019. And he is indeed one of our preeminent public intellectuals in America today. He has appeared on every imaginable broadcast and podcast that you can imagine, from Tucker Carlson, Fox and Friends, Glenn Beck, and the Epoch Times American Thought Leaders series. Michael, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Jason. Thanks for having me.
So when we hear the term woke, and when we hear the term woke, when we hear this, there's a lot of conceptual confusion, Michael, around the term wokeism and cancel culture. But let's begin. I'm a philosopher. You're an academic. Let's begin by defining our terms. What briefly, just what is woke culture or wokeism? Because I think a lot of people hear it in lay people, they invoke it, and they really don't understand what it is.
Well, the origin of the term, it really dates to the 70s, actually, and it started to signify in the African American community an awareness, just being basically aware of what's happening, and then it took on the meaning of being socially conscious of racial injustice, and it has since changed to include all forms of social justice, so that it now means effectively any kind of awareness of social injustice. And it's really invoked to instigate a sting of conscience in the newly woke subject, to make them feel that they have been effectively sinners. They have been sinners against other people, and they need to repent and change their behavior. It's very similar to the Christian notion of being saved, but there are distinctions which I could talk about.
Well, before we talk about those distinctions, people often invoke the term social justice when they think about like the civil rights movement and the early suffragette movement. And they make a distinction between, lowercase social justice and uppercase social justice. What is morally speaking and conceptually speaking also, what is the difference between the social justice that, let's say, Martin Luther King would have advanced and did advance, and the kind of social justice that we're seeing today?
Oh, well, there's quite a bit of differences. First of all, social justice goes all the way back to the 19th century with Luigi Tapparelli and his notion of social justice, which he advanced as a kind of new form of justice in the Catholic canon, in effect. And then, it's been taken up by liberal and leftist philosophers ever since, like John Rawls, and in the 70s. And but today, it has incorporated what I think are the techniques and practices of Stalinism and Maoism, such that it now includes such things so that it has parallels to, and it includes analogs to the Cultural Revolution in China, for example, the practices of autocritique or self-criticism and struggle sessions. So it has become a kind of crusade by which people are basically called out and then subjected to a kind of struggle session, or they're required to submit themselves to an autocritique or self-criticism to lay bare their ideological and personal flaws, their lack of adherence or purity with reference to the creed. So we're looking at now a kind of a cultural revolution in which we see people having to be subjected to these kind of struggle sessions online and in their universities and in their places of work, such that we now have critical race theory effectively in all corporations and the government and almost every other sphere of activity. So I think it's really picked up. It also has played on and incorporated elements of postmodern theory, I believe. This is where the transgender movement comes in, basically where, language now is really all determinative. And what we are is what we say we are. And this becomes problematic epistemologically and so forth. So this is where I think we are now, where we're in a post-Maoist condition here with wokeness and social justice.
Well, in your books, Snowflakes, Springtime for Snowflakes, Social Justice, and its Postmodern Parentage, which is a fabulous book, that is the provenance of the movement. That you trace it back, its antecedent to postmodernism. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, why now? Is it just a matter of the chickens having come home to roost? Why now? From, I think, maybe as far back as 2014 or 2013. Why now at this particular juncture have these movements, the cancel culture, the social justice warriors, the woke supremacists, why have they arisen at this particular juncture in our society?
Well, that's a great question. I think the real emergence, I can think, would be tracked to the emergence of Donald Trump, frankly, and the reaction to him and his supposed racism and nativism and so forth. So I think that whenever Trump came out and started to condemn social justice and political correctness, now an antiquated term, really, then all the forces of the left really they emerged and they consolidated around this concept. They consolidated their they began to circle the wagons, and basically they then came to exclude anybody that wasn't buying into the social justice creed. And that's exactly what happened to me.
One of the things that, as an academic who's been censured himself and cancelled and formally censured by his university, I want to ask you what accounts for this general recalcitrance on the part of society. So let's take the trans fascists, all right, the transgender ideologists and their impositions on society, their various impositions on society. And the absence of what I would call a full frontal pushback against nonsense like the idea that men can have babies or that biological men can become women, that you can just flout the conventions of grammar and choose a particular pronoun. Why the herd-like acceptance of all this kind of malarkey, Dr. Rectenwald? Why have we not seen more massive pushback, but instead we've seen a society of individuals who exhibit absolute fear and have not, we're seeing some sort of pushback now among especially parents in schools where they're told by K through 12 teachers, do not gender your children because we're not going to gender them in the classroom. So now we're seeing a little bit of pushback. But in general, especially in corporations, especially just among lay persons, why have we just not seen any kind of massive pushback, but a sort of herd-like acceptance of the impositions of these groups?
Well, I think you put your finger on it right there at the end with the word herd. And I think that the herd mentality has really kicked in. And the herd mentality has two basic modes of operation. And one of them is terror. I think they terrorize the non-compliant, and the second one is that you gain power by being part of the herd. So it's both. It's got two modes of reinforcement. You gain power by being part of the herd, and you see what happens to people that run afoul of the herd, and this terrorizes you and incentivizes you to join the herd. I think that's effectively what's going on.
So in effect, people sort of their quest for power or their longing for power in some sense supersedes their own moral values. They would rather sort of buy into the herd and the advantages that go along with buying into the herd. Those trump their moral values in some sense.
Well, I think it replaces them. It supplants their standard moral values and replaces them with a new set that is along the lines of social justice and wokeness. This gives you a different value system. And then you start to evaluate other people on the basis of this new value system. And it supplants the older value system, say, of, equalitarianism, just outright acceptance of other individuals as equal based on the fact that they're human beings. Now we have a way of discriminating between human beings on the basis of their acceptance or not of this new moral hierarchy.
I really take the point of the replacement quite seriously. Do you think that the radical left that has sort of spawned the social justice warriors and the woke supremacists and the whole woke culture is right now in a sort of inverse manner, not so inverse manner, is instituting a new form of McCarthyism? I mean, you talk about the kinds of purges and the kinds of associations with Maoism. Are these new ideological purges the sort of, and which include bias reporting that you do a great job of talking about? Is this a new form of McCarthyism that we're just not recognizing in a much subtler form or not so subtler form?
Yeah, I think it's a new leftist McCarthyism, and it's quite ironic because we have the left now engaging in a kind of McCarthyism where they're looking for all of the offenders, under the bed and basically trying to destroy them, just like McCarthy. I think McCarthy was right about the infiltration of all these communists in the state and in the elite institutions and in the nonprofit philanthropic organizations. He was absolutely correct, and he was wrong to the extent that he he breached people's individual constitutional rights, but otherwise correct in seeing what he did. But we have a new leftist McCarthyism that is doing the same thing. Interestingly, almost everything has been inverted. Now it's the left that's calling out Russia, 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 and it's the right that's trying to deflect from that and suggest that this isn't our mortal enemy. In fact, just like the left said during the McCarthy era, the mortal enemy they suggested was McCarthy and the McCarthyist movement. So they're saying now that the mortal enemy is Russia, but it's quite an inversion. So we have the same thing, but everybody's taken different roles. They've all shifted places. So yes, I think that is a very good characterization.
I've had different people on the show. I had Michael Robillard, who's written a very interesting book called Don't Go to College, Start the Revolution. And his position, I think, is something on the order that it's just way too late. I have said the universities are over. He believes that they're cults, really, and indoctrination centers. And his solution is just people not go to college unless you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or you need a particular profession like medicine, but to affix yourself to apprentice yourself to an entrepreneur business and start your own company or something on that order. There are people like David Horowitz who think you should fight fire with fire. If this is a new form of McCarthyism, then you fight, you vanquish your enemy and you fight to the bitter end. What do you, first of all, do you think that the universes are just beyond redemption, that we're far gone? And what's your take on that? And what's your solution? How do we sort of, since the woke supremacists really have declared that they're enemies of reason and logic because these are constructs of white male European supremacists themselves. And they don't believe in reason and logic and argumentation. It's just feelings and emoting, and it's like beggars making invidious comparisons among their swords, who has the greatest grievances. What's your solution for remedying or fighting the woke supremacists or woke culture in general? And do you think we're just too far gone?
Well, I think universities are too far gone. I've been on a mailing list with a number of dissident professors, inclusive of Jordan Peterson, Gad Saad, and others. And I rarely participate because I feel like it's a fait accompli. The water is too far under the bridge. These universities are rotten to the core, and this is not really where the battle lies anymore. This is something that maybe we could recuperate after we struggle in the more civil society where wokeness is now taking on a form of it's a demarcation device that's being used to destroy companies and not just individuals, but all kinds of means of production. And I could go into woke capitalism later, but I think the universities are history. And so the battle is somewhere else now. I think the battle lies in fighting the kind of deindustrialization that is being conducted under the rubric of the ESG score and stakeholder capitalism, which it's coming out of the World Economic Forum and the UN. And this is threatening not just our free speech, but rather our survivability. This threatens industrial civilization. And so I think that academia is kind of academic at this point. I would say we could recuperate these institutions later after we fight at the front. The front line is somewhere else. That's what I'm getting at. I think it's a rearguard movement at this point to fight in academia.
We're going to take a short break. And when we come back, I want to hear a little bit more about where you think the solutions lie in terms of fighting at the front line. We're talking to Michael Rectenwald. He's the author of 11 books, including Beyond Woke, Springtime for Snowflakes, Social Justice, and its Postmodern Parentage. I'm Jason Hill, and you're listening to The Jason Hill Show. Welcome back to the show. I'm Jason Hill, and this is the Jason Hill Show. We're talking to Michael Rectenwald, who is the author, as I said, of 11 books, including Beyond Woke, Springtime for Snowflakes, Social Justice, and its Postmodern Parentage. Michael, before we went to break, you thought that the universities were just rotten to the core, that they were over, and the battle lies elsewhere in terms of fighting for, I would say, a renaissance or the restoration of our civilization, or maybe just preventing it from an imminent decline. Would you want to talk a little bit more about where you see that? Because you mentioned stakeholder capitalism, and I'm very interested in that topic. Do you want to say more about where you see the real battle?
Sure. I think it really does lie along the lines of fighting against the kinds of deindustrialization and decivilization movement that is coming out of the World Economic Forum and the UN and any number of affiliated groups, and that they're taking wokeness to a whole nother level now. There's woke capitalism, which I've described as a monopoly scheme and a means of driving out competitors using kind of woke criteria as the demarcation device. So I think that we need to worry about some much larger matters, like what they intend to do to our productive capacities with the green movement and environmentalism, the climate catastrophism. This is going to be a major battle. And I've argued that wokeness really is the ideological component of this. It is a mechanism it's an ideological means by which the elite, for lack of a better term, are trying to get the masses to accept reduced conditions, reduced standards of living, reduced consumption. It is a way of shaming them and believing that their former way of life was a matter of privilege that they didn't have any title to, and that they should be disenfranchised from, that they should accept, eating bugs and living, without traveling and using gas, and basically live at a much more reduced static standard of living. These, I think, are the issues that really face us now. And I don't just say that because I'm out of the academy, because when I did leave the academy, I recognized that I had struck a third rail and that there was a lot of power behind this movement, that it wasn't just coming from the ground up, but that I think it's actually, now I start to believe that it's a top-down movement, that it's really emanated from organizations like the United Nations, and their rhetoric has been pointing to this all this time. For 50 plus years, about reducing our way of life, reducing the standards of living, subjecting the developed world to a shaming campaign, such that they would relinquish basically their lifestyles and so forth. So that's where I think we are now, and those are the battles that I'm fighting.
Well, Michael, I must ask you, why would any number of C-suite executives or CEO of a company I can understand the UN, they're a bunch of thugs, really, and hooligans, advocating this sort of malarkey. Why would any number of C-suite executives or CEOs of a corporation go along with what you called corporate socialism in your book and woke capitalism? What's the connection there? What's the because I can understand the agenda of the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, but what's in it for those executives, those CEOs, those owners of corporations to back what you called the one world state, monopolistic government or corporation?
Well, first of all, it's very similar to the process that happens with reference to individuals. You could either be part of this, what I call woke cartel, or you could be excluded. And so it gives them a first mover advantage of getting on board with what is looking like a tsunami and that can't be really averted. And then the incentive is they gain monopoly power. They become part of a shared monopoly scheme so that effectively banishes competitors from the field and gives them the opportunity to reap the exclusive rewards that come with woke capitalism or corporate socialism or what have you, whatever you want to call it. It's a form of economic fascism, frankly. It's using this kind of a cartel scheme to a woke cartel scheme to drive out competitors. So what's in it for them is survivability. They're looking to stay on the right side of history, as they would put it, and not be left behind. So you have the leading asset managers in the world like BlackRock Inc. and Vanguard Group and State Street. You have the leading banks in the United States like Bank of America and so many others full-heartedly behind this movement. I mean, we're facing, it is a tsunami now. There's a tremendous amount of momentum behind all this, and it's going to take quite an act of a feat, an heroic David and Goliath feat to fend it off.
And who will be the major players? Who will be the major actors who will fend this off? Will it be will it be some sort of public, a light enlightening the public? And who are the major actors who will fend this off?
Well, we need some defections amongst the elite. We need elite defectors, first of all, because without that, we won't have any voice, and there'll be no press coverage. There'll be no acknowledgement of the vast majority who stand to lose from this campaign. So we need elite defectors, but other than that, we're looking at, lawmakers are kind of ineffectual here because this whole scheme circumvents legislation and it's very anti-democratic. It's stakeholder capitalism draws these corporations into a hybrid conjunction with the state and allows them to push all this without any legislation. It undermines and subverts the legislative process entirely and puts it on us as a kind of de facto way it is. And there seems to be no recourse legislatively. So it's going to be the vast majority of people who stand to lose so much, which would be just about everybody, inclusive of poor people, I think, because the misery, the increase in misery stands to be tremendous. Because if they de-industrialize our agricultural processes, our manufacturing processes, our transportation system, all of this stands to land us in a kind of pre-industrial stage. All the while they have technologies to surveil and track and trace us everywhere we go. So it'll be a very weird situation in which you have people burning logs to keep warm while they're tracked and traced by high-tech AI and other, brain cloud interfaces or whatever else they have in store. So it's going to be the people. It's going to be a broad swath of the population who is finally going to say this is lunacy, and it's going to take some leaders amongst the elite to actually stand up and decry and to put the brakes on and say this is lunacy.
So in effect, people will have to start suffering. I mean, they'll have to start feeling it in the lowered standard of living and in their pocketbooks, and then start realizing that 2 + 2 = 4, not 5, and dotting their I's and seeing the connections before we see some sort of action. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to take some pain, and they'll have to put the pieces together and see where all this is coming from. They'll hopefully, we have a great segment of the left that is completely marching in lockstep on all this without any consideration of the fraud that's being perpetrated against them as well. They're on schedule to have their lives tremendously altered as well, and they have them, basically gaslit beyond words. So it's hard to see that they'll be part of it. In fact, they're kind of like the soldiers, the foot soldiers for these elites who are carrying this out. So it's going to take probably a little bit of strife and struggle between these two contingents.
Are there any elite defectors that you would name publicly, or potential elite defectors who are sort of gadflies, who are sort of already defecting or on the verge of defecting, who could cause a ripple effect that would catalyze others into or motivate others into defecting?
Yes, I mean, you have Elon Musk is a very interesting case. On the one hand, he's the CEO of Neuralink, which is a transhuman technology that would basically tap into your brain and so forth, and conduct two-way flows between your neocortex and the cloud. But on the other hand, he's squarely been put in the crosshairs of this woke cartel, and they such that he has, since his move to buy Twitter, they've basically trying to cancel him, but he's too formidable of an opponent. Nevertheless, interestingly enough, to show you how hypocritical and contradictory this all is, that his Tesla, probably one of the largest manufacturers of electric vehicles in the world, was nevertheless thrown off of the S&P 500's ESG index entirely, while ExxonMobil is rated in the top 10. So it just shows you how absurd this whole system is, this stakeholder ESG regime really is what it is. He's one. There are a few others that are a little ambiguous, like Peter Thiel, and I could say Trump is an elite defector in a sense. I mean, he was never really part of the top echelon, but close enough to cause trouble. And I'm not some great Trump supporter, but on the other hand, it's hard not to recognize that he's posed some threat to their machinations.
Right. Let's talk a little bit more about how the defectors work in terms of straddling the fence, in terms of having one foot in being, in some sense, stakeholder capitalists, largely because that's where the majority of that's where the majority of their business lies, but also being revolutionaries in one sense by being defectors, and financially the costs are costs that they can bear. But I'm interested in hearing what you think about would be their deeper motivation for being defectors when, in effect, playing it safe would be a lot easier for them. Is this something that is a movement or change that's coming from a moral center within them, within their own psyche, within their own spirit or a moral center of gravity out of which they're operating? What is the motivation really for being an elite defector in today's world?
Yeah, I think it's definitely moral, it's ethical, and it's economic in the long run if they're thinking on a longer term scale. On a longer term scale, I mean, if they look at you can project out what's going to happen if this continues, and it'll collapse the economy to a greater extent than it's already collapsing. So they have interests that lie with this economically, with opposing it in the long term, at least. I think it is right now. It is go woke or go broke at this juncture, but in the long term, it will become go woke and go broke because it can't sustain itself. Ironically, this system is unsustainable, which, of course, sustainability is their big keyword. But I think there's moral issues too. Do they really want civilization as we know it to collapse? Do they want to preclude this from happening? I think people will recognize in their long-term interest, but also the moral interest they have in to the rest of the world, that this would not be good.
Before we take another short break and get into your story, which is a very, very fascinating story, I want to ask you a very, very illiberal question. All of this, what you just talked about, and also just woke supremacists and wokeism and cancel culture, bias reporting, the trans fascists, trigger warning, safe spaces, everything that constitutes woke culture today. Could all of this be just a failure of liberalism in the sense that a particular consequence of liberalism has resulted in what I would call the over-democratization of our society, that too many people have just been led into the future, too many social ballasts, too many inverts, just people who can leverage the lowest common denominator element within themselves and elevated all of that to a cult. And there are no forces to practice the hierarchical exclusionary act of rational discrimination. Patrick Dean wrote an interesting book called Why Liberalism Failed, and I agree with some of it, I disagree with some of it. But also, is this just has our society just become too over-democratized? And you see this in the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs where everyone gets led into the future. Not everyone can get led into the future. It's a very illiberal thing to say, actually. But could all of this be just that we have a sort of sense in which the politics has pandered to not an aspiration of the high, but the lowest common denominator in everyone? And the lowest common denominator has been elevated to the level of a cult. And there is no vetting process. There are no vetting processes where rational discrimination can take place. And so the reason that we, for example, allow the fact that people can say men can have babies, or the reason that all sorts of falsehoods get passed as truth is not because there really is an attack on reason and logic, but because of something called metaphysical egalitarianism, where everyone has his or her sense of truth, and truth has now become democratized. So a fallout of egalitarianism is that if everybody is equal, which we're not, and everybody is the same, which we're not, then everyone must have his piece of truth. And this seems to me the result of both the virtue and the fallout of liberalism and a society that has just become really overtly democratized. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it, and I could hardly match it, actually. I think that, first of all, I would say that this creed is an inversion ideology that works to invert the hierarchy and to elevate from the bottom to the top, to flip this putative social hierarchy on its head, and then to celebrate those that have been elevated by virtue of this inversion. and then to accord them epistemological sovereignty, because whatever they say goes, because it's their truth, and my truth trumps all other objective truth. So it's, I think, more than democratization in the sense that it's an inversion of a putative social hierarchy that is said to have existed, and then takes the bottom and makes it the top, and likewise all of the consequences that follow from that, including this new epistemological sovereignty that obtains with reference to the individuals who are likewise, thrust to the top of the pyramid. So I think it's just a morass of egalitarianism, but it's also a new structural hierarchy.
And it's very difficult when you sort of try to annihilate that epistemological privilege or sovereignty and you take it away. I mean, you lose your job, you lose your status, you have people's lives are destroyed, and it's not that with full forethought of malice that you're taking it away from people. It's that through philosophical and scientific meaning tests, you have proven people to be wrong, but those criteria that constitute the meaning test themselves have been cancelled, have been deemed racist, have been deemed patriarchal or imperial. We're going to take a short break. My guest is Michael Rectenwald. He's the author of Beyond Woke. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about Dr. Rectenwald's struggles, really, and why he's been cancelled and censured, and just know a little bit more about the person himself. This is Jason Hill, and this is the Jason Hill Show. Right back. All right, welcome back to the show. I'm Jason Hill, and this is the Jason Hill Show. My guest is Michael Rectenwald, and we've been talking about woke. He's the author of Beyond Woke and several other books. Another favorite of mine is Springtime for Snowflakes, Social Justice, and its Postmodern Parentage. Michael, I'd like you to share with the listeners, you have been persecuted and prosecuted, and you're one of our preeminent public intellectuals. You're everywhere. People know about you. You have a huge following. Tell us a little bit about your story. I mean, how did you get to be so censured and so pilloried, really, by the academic institution, and what led to this, and how do you cope, and what are you working on? And
Great. Yeah, so I was a leftist, as you may know, and I was actually a Marxist, and I was critiquing, identity politics from the left at the outset, and I voiced some issues about social justice and wokeness on campus at NYU and elsewhere in an interview with the student newspaper, and 2 days after that interview appeared, I was called into the dean's office, coerced into a leave of absence, condemned by the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion group, and pilloried by the faculty vis-a-vis email. And it was ugly. They moved my office to the Russian department, which I had no affiliation with whatsoever. They excluded me. I was a pariah on campus, effectively. I ended up suing the colleagues who defamed me and libeled me over email, and the university for permitting it. And, we settled it, but it wasn't really that great of a settlement. I got a settlement. And since then, I've been just on this this quest to uncover what's behind all this, because I recognized I'd really touched the third rail, and I didn't realize that the force of power that was behind all of this, and the administration the top administration at NYU came down on me like a ton of bricks. My attorneys told me that they never had seen a case in which the opponent viscerally hated the client like they did me. For what reason, I don't exactly know, except that I really crossed, I think, I really crossed and critiqued their creed, and they didn't like that whatsoever. And so it just proved to me that there was significant power behind all of this. It wasn't simply these blue-haired kids on campus screeching in the classroom. This was the regime's ideology. And that's led me on this quest. And I studied it in connection with academia first. That's Springtime for Snowflakes. And then I moved on to look at it in terms of big tech and big digital. And that's Google Archipelago. And then I wrote a novel in the interim called Thought Criminal. And now I just finished a book on the Great Reset. It's called The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, Unraveling the Global Agenda, in which I really try to find out who these people are, what their interests are, and what they're up to. So I start to name names. And that's basically the quest I've been on since leaving academia.
Now, is the Great Reset available? Is that out?
It's available for pre-order on my website. It'll be out in December for delivery.
Good. So academia itself, it sounds like you're saying, is actually not even the major culprit. There are forces that are overseeing the machinations of academia, right?
Yes, absolutely. Academia is just the ideological apparatus through which all of this has been spread, but they're not. It is kind of just an instrument of this global elite, really, that has been really driving all of this from the beginning. So yeah, academia is just an operation that has a function to perpetrate this ideology and spread it and indoctrinate people into it. But really, the larger scheme is this world resetting, this global reset that's underway. That's really where it's coming from.
And that, of course, comprises, you said, the United Nations, a set of corporate elites.
World Economic Forum and their thousands of corporate partners and their stakeholder capitalist regime and all the mechanisms that they're using to bring it home. And this also connects to older globalist organizations like the Bilderberg Group. I know this probably sounds conspiratorial, but no, they've been involved. The Club of Rome and their Malthusian and neo-Malthusianism. All of this is intimately connected. They're all connected to the WEF, and the WEF is a partner with the UN, and they all implicitly or explicitly endorse this Great Reset agenda.
Given all that you said, Michael, it sounds like a lot for people to take in. I know a lot in terms of the moral division of labor. When we think of what we can do to fight, each of us has to take up his share in terms of where his or her talents lie. I know there are any number of people who will listen to the show, and some will sort of feel a sense of paralysis, like, oh my God, I thought it was my K through 12 teacher who was the ultimate culprit. And some will think, I thought it was universities because I've been listening to professors say it shut down the university, defund the universities. Now I'm hearing that, it's the World Economic Forum and the United Nations and an amalgamation, a phalanx of a cabal, really, of nefarious forces. And clearly one cannot fight. In the previous section, we've talked about elite defectors. One cannot fight a battle on many fronts. I want to ask you, as an individual, as a former academic, but as really as an intellectual activist, as a writer, as a public intellectual, how do you determine? Because I think this will influence a lot of people who are listening. How do you determine which, among all the battles that are potentially yours to fight, how do you determine which battle to take on at any given moment, given the plethora of options that you have?
That's a great question, Jason. I take it from basically if there are puppet masters, which I believe there are, the fight is really to we may not be able to locate them exactly, but one thing we can do is that if they're pulling strings, what we can do is disattach these strings from ourselves. We can cut the strings. We don't even have to know who is up there. If you can cut the strings of dependence on this and cut the strings that allow them to pull your chain to make you move in certain ways that you wouldn't otherwise move, then you've gone a long way to defeating them. And so I've laid out a plan in my new book, The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, of how to cut these strings. Get these people off of your body, off of your mind, out of your life. And the way to do that is to live a free life. That is to live a free market, individual life of autonomy, relative autonomy, or whatever you want to call it, and to effectively divorce yourself from their schemes, to practice the free market in your own life, to be as entrepreneurial as you possibly can, to divest from their ESG and other stakeholder mechanisms, to decouple yourself from the institutions that are perpetrating this, like the academic world. I agree with what your former guest said. I think that getting out and staying out of the institutions like academia and others are key moves to make. These institutions are merely reproducing, to put it in Marxist terms, they're just reproducing the subjects they want you to be. So if you don't let them reproduce you as their kind of subject, then you've gone a long way to resisting their scheme.
And do you think, Michael, I mean, I'm an immigrant here. I came here when I was 37 years ago when I was 20. And I've always been impressed. I've been to about 40 countries and I've lived in Europe for a while. And I've always come back feeling Americans are really an exceptional people because they're problem solvers. They fix things. They're not a bitter people. They're not really a cynical people. I've seen the other side. I've seen the sort of passivity and the inertia and the sort of fatalism that characterizes other nations and other cultures. And one thing that has impressed me about Americans is that they're can-do, they're problem solvers. Do you think that Americans have today what it takes to implement the solutions that you're going to lay out in the Great Reset? Do we have the discipline? Do we have the fortitude? Do we have the grit, the tenacity to effect in the world what you think is necessary to solve these problems?
Great question. I think there's a contingent of Americans that are very recalcitrant to this, that are very resistant, that have a tremendous amount of belief in individual rights and liberty, and that understand, that this global socialism that they're trying to impose is not the panacea at all that they make it out to be. In fact, it's quite the inverse, that everything they say is effectively the inverse of the truth, that they're effectively trying to perpetrate reversive blockades on us. That is, they're trying to block the truth from us by stating the opposite of it all the time. And I think there's enough people, if it's not enough to save what we have, it's enough for a remnant that will pass into the future, that will thrive whenever this disaster is fully felt. So I'm not sure that we will, in our lifetimes, Jason, see this, but I believe that there has to be a remnant that will keep alive the American project.
And so you do have faith and optimism in the resilient will and grit of the American people, ultimately.
Definitely.
Definitely. Michael, I want to thank you very much for coming on and sharing so much of your fire. And there is a fire beneath the calm veneer of your voice. And for talking us through so many of these problems that exist beneath the problems that we think exist, that there are deeper channels that are lurking beneath what we think are the major problems. And I think our listeners will understand what I'm saying. I'm not just talking circles, that academia is not just the problem, that your local K-12 teacher is not the problem, that there are greater forces that you've identified for us that will leave our listeners very, very enlightened. I can't wait to read Great Reset. You have to come back to talk about that book when it's released. And I wish you all the best. Thank you for all that you do for America and for our culture and for civilization. Michael, thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
The Jason Hill Show is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.